In 1964, the city of Halifax made a decision. It decided that a community of several hundred Black Canadians, people whose families had lived on the same land for over 150 years, who had built their own church, their own school, their own social fabric from nothing, needed to be removed. The city called it urban renewal. It called it progress. It called it with a straight face an act of compassion, a relocation that would improve the living conditions of the people being displaced. What it actually was demolition, not just of buildings, of a community, of a history, of a place that had survived slavery, segregation, 2 world wars, and a century of deliberate neglect, and had managed, against every structural obstacle placed in its path, to become something real. The city of Halifax destroyed it in 4 years, and then spent the next 4 decades pretending it hadn't meant to. This is the story of Africville. Africville sat on the southern shore of the Bedford Basin at the northern edge of the Halifax Peninsula. It was not a large community. At its peak it held perhaps 400 people, families who had lived there for generations, whose grandparents and great-grandparents had settled that particular patch of land when almost nowhere else in Nova Scotia would have them. The land itself was not glamorous. It was rocky, exposed to the wind off the basin, far enough from the center of Halifax that it existed in a kind of official invisibility. The city of Halifax knew Africville was there. It had always known. It simply chose, for most of its history, to treat that knowledge as irrelevant to any planning decision that might benefit the people living there. But from the shore of the basin, looking out across the water, Africville had something that no planning document ever acknowledged. It had a view. It had roots. It had the particular quality of a place that people had chosen and stayed in and made their own over generations. That is not a small thing, and the city of Halifax was about to take it. The story of Africville begins not with urban planning, but with the aftermath of the American Revolution. When Black loyalists, free Black people who had sided with the British during the Revolutionary War and been promised land and freedom in return, arrived in Nova Scotia in the 1780s and 1790s, they encountered a province that had made promises it had no intention of keeping. The land grants given to Black loyalists were systematically inferior to those given to white loyalists. Smaller, rockier, less fertile. In worse locations, the promises of equal treatment evaporated almost immediately upon arrival. Some of these families eventually settled in the area that would become Africville. They built on land that nobody else wanted. They built on it because it was what they had. And over generations, slowly, incrementally, without any assistance from any level of government, they built something that worked: a church. The Seaview African United Baptist Church, which became the spiritual and social center of the community. A school. Small houses, gardens, a fishing economy supplemented by work in Halifax when work was available. They did not build Africville because it was easy. They built it because the alternative was nothing. Here is the part of Africville's story that transforms it from a tragedy into something more precise, something more deliberately engineered. The city of Halifax never extended basic municipal services to Africville. No running water, no sewage system, no garbage collection, no paved roads, no street lighting. For the entire span of Africville's existence, the community received essentially none of the infrastructure that the city provided as a matter of course to every other neighborhood within its boundaries, and simultaneously, this is the detail that makes the neglect impossible to characterize as mere oversight. The city used the land immediately surrounding Africville as a dumping ground for the facilities that no other neighborhood would accept. A slaughterhouse was built adjacent to Africville in the 1800s, a bone-dry fertilizer plant, an infectious disease hospital, a coal distribution plant, a tar factory. And in 1955, a city garbage dump, an open landfill, was established directly beside the community. The residents of Africville complained. They petitioned the city. They wrote letters. They appeared before council. For decades, their complaints were received, acknowledged, filed, and ignored. The city that refused to give Africville running water did not hesitate to place its most undesirable industrial facilities on Africville's doorstep. This was not negligence. It was a policy. It simply was never written down as one. The Seaview African United Baptist Church was the heart of Africville. It was built in 1849 on the high ground of the community, visible from the Basin. It was the place where Africville marked its births and its deaths and its marriages, where community meetings were held, where the children who attended were told, week after week, that they had value, in a city that was spending considerable institutional energy communicating the opposite. The church survived everything that the city threw at Africville's doorstep. The slaughterhouse, the fertilizer plant, the dump, the decades of withheld services. The church was there before any of those things, and it was still standing when the bulldozers arrived. When the city of Halifax finally demolished Africville in the late 1960s, the church was one of the last structures to come down. Residents described watching it fall as watching the community itself die. Not metaphorically, but literally. The building that had held the community together for over a century, that had been the reason people stayed when every material condition of their lives was being made worse by deliberate policy, was reduced to rubble and cleared from the land. The city moved quickly. It did not want a ruin. It wanted an empty lot. In 1964, the city of Halifax hired a social worker named Peter MacDonald to develop a relocation plan for Africville. MacDonald's report, delivered to City Council, was honest in ways that the city's subsequent public messaging was not. He acknowledged that the conditions in Africville were the direct result of decades of municipal neglect. He acknowledged that the community had repeatedly requested services and been denied. He acknowledged that simply demolishing the neighborhood without meaningful compensation or support would constitute a serious injustice. The city received the report. It accepted the parts that justified demolition. It disregarded the parts that required accountability. Residents were offered relocation assistance. What that assistance looked like in practice was this. City workers arrived at homes in Africville with dump trucks. Residents were given short notice to pack what they could. Their remaining belongings, furniture, appliances, personal effects, were loaded onto the dump trucks, along with the debris from the demolition. People's possessions were transported in garbage trucks by the city that had been depositing garbage on their doorstep for decades. Some residents received financial compensation. The amounts were, by any standard, inadequate. Properties that the city had deliberately suppressed in value through decades of neglect were assessed at the suppressed value, and residents were paid accordingly for land that the city itself had made worthless. Between 1964 and 1970, every structure in Africville was demolished. The houses, the church, the small businesses, the community center, the school, everything that 4 or 5 generations of Black Nova Scotians had built on that land without help from any government at any level was removed. The residents were relocated to public housing in Halifax, largely to Mulgrave Park, a housing project in the north end of the city. They were scattered. The social networks that had sustained the community, the web of relationships built over generations of living in the same place, knowing the same families, sharing the same institutions, were severed by the geography of the relocation. You cannot relocate a community. You can relocate the individuals who composed it. But the community itself, the thing that existed between the people in the relationships and the shared history and the accumulated knowledge of a place, that does not survive being scattered across a city's public housing inventory. Halifax relocated the people of Africville. The community of Africville it simply destroyed. On the land where Africville stood, the city of Halifax built a bridge approach. The A. Murray Mackay Bridge, completed in 1970, required the land that Africville had occupied for generations. This is sometimes presented as the reason for the demolition, as though the bridge made it necessary. The bridge approach does not cover the entirety of the former Africville land. A significant portion of it sat unused for years after demolition. A dog park was eventually established on part of it. The community that had built a church and a school and a social world on that land, the community that had petitioned for running water for decades and been denied, was removed, and in its place the city built a dog park. This is not a metaphor, it is what happened. For roughly 30 years after the demolition of Africville, the city of Halifax said very little about what it had done. There was no inquiry, no independent assessment of whether the relocation had been conducted justly, no examination of whether the compensation paid had been adequate, no acknowledgement that the deliberate policy of withholding municipal services had contributed to the conditions that were then used to justify demolition. Former residents and their descendants maintained the memory of Africville. They organized reunions. They documented the history. They kept the story alive in the ways that communities keep stories alive when the institutions around them prefer silence. Through oral history, through family memory, through the specific persistence of people who know that what happened to them matters even when nobody official agrees. The city's silence was not passive. It required active maintenance. Questions about Africville that arose in public forums were managed. The subject was not comfortable for Halifax, and discomfort has always been an effective suppressant of institutional honesty. In 2010, 40 years after the last building in Africville was demolished, the city of Halifax issued a formal apology. Mayor Peter Kelly stood before a gathering of former Africville residents and their descendants and acknowledged what the city had done. He acknowledged the deliberate withholding of services. He acknowledged the inadequacy of the compensation. He acknowledged that the relocation had been conducted in ways that caused serious harm. The city also established a reconciliation fund of $3 million to be distributed among former residents and their descendants and committed to rebuilding the Seaview United Baptist Church on the original site. The church was rebuilt. It stands on the shore of the Bedford Basin today, a replica of the structure that was demolished on the land where the community once existed, in a neighborhood that is now primarily industrial and commercial. Former residents have described attending services in the rebuilt church as profoundly strange. The building is there, the land is there, but the community that gave the church its meaning, the 400 people, the generations of families, the social world, is not coming back. An apology can acknowledge what was done. It cannot undo it. Not every former Africville resident accepted the apology as sufficient. Many felt that $3 million, distributed among hundreds of former residents and their descendants over 40 years of legal interest, fell significantly short of what genuine restitution would require. That a rebuilt church on an otherwise cleared industrial site was not the same as the return of a community. That 40 years of official silence had compounded the original harm in ways that a single ceremony could not address. Several former residents have given testimony over the years describing the specific damage that the relocation caused, not just financial, not just material, but psychological. The loss of place, the severing from community, the experience of watching everything your family had built, everything that had sustained your sense of who you were and where you came from, be loaded onto dump trucks and carted away. These are not abstractions. They are the documented experiences of specific people, people who are still alive, whose children and grandchildren live in Halifax today, in a city that built a dog park on their grandparents' land and took 40 years to say it was sorry. If you visit the site of Africville today, you will find Africville Park. There is a small interpretive center. There is the rebuilt church. There are information panels describing the history of the community. There is a view of the Bedford Basin that is genuinely beautiful. There is also, immediately adjacent, the infrastructure of the Mackay Bridge. And beyond that, the industrial facilities that the city established on Africville's borders over the course of a century. The slaughterhouse is gone, but the landscape communicates clearly what this land was used for and who it was considered appropriate to place here. The information panels in Africville Park tell the story accurately. They do not minimize what happened. They describe the deliberate withholding of services, the inadequate compensation, the relocation by garbage truck. Reading them, standing on the land, looking at the rebuilt church surrounded by industrial infrastructure and bridge approaches, it is possible to understand something that no official document has ever fully stated. The city of Halifax did not make a mistake with Africville. It implemented a policy. The policy was never written down in terms that would have made its nature explicit, but it was consistent, sustained over more than a century, and produced exactly the outcomes it was designed to produce. That is not a mistake. That is a choice. Africville is not an isolated story. Across Canada, Black communities established by Black loyalists and freed slaves in the aftermath of the American Revolution faced versions of the same pattern: land grants inferior to those given to white settlers, deliberate exclusion from municipal services, gradual displacement through a combination of neglect and development pressure. The specific geography changed. The mechanism remained consistent. Communities that had built something real on land that nobody else wanted were, at the moment that land became valuable or convenient for other purposes, removed. The pattern is documented. It is not controversial among historians. It is simply not part of the version of Canadian history that most Canadians encounter in school or in the national narrative that Canada tells about itself, a narrative centered on tolerance, multiculturalism, and a fundamentally decent relationship with its own past. Africville is one place where that narrative fails its most basic test, where the documented facts of what happened are simply incompatible with the story Canada prefers to tell. That incompatibility is not going away, and neither is the documentation. The Bedford Basin still catches the light the same way it always has. On a clear day, standing where Africville stood, the water looks almost silver. The hills on the far shore are green in summer. The sky is wide. It is, despite everything, a beautiful place. The people who lived here knew that. They knew it for 150 years. They built their church on the high ground so it could see the water. They stayed through the slaughterhouse and the dump and the decades of withheld services because this was their place. Because belonging somewhere, really belonging, with history and roots and community, is not something people abandon easily. The city of Halifax took that from them, efficiently, legally, with the full apparatus of municipal government, planning documents, relocation assistance forms, and dump trucks. And then it built a park, and put up information panels, and issued an apology. Canada is very good at apologies, at acknowledgements, at the formal language of reconciliation. What it has always been less good at is not doing the thing that requires the apology in the first place. This is dark Canada, where the history that was paved over gets excavated. Subscribe, because Africville is not the only community this country erased, and the others are still waiting to be found.